Sit back and relive the 33 days that rewrote the map of the world, the crossing that changed everything forever. Sit back and relive the 33 days that rewrote the map of the world, the crossing that changed everything forever.
In the summer of 1492, a Genoese mariner of ferocious ambition stood on the docks of Palos de la Frontera in southern Spain and looked west across an ocean that no European had ever crossed. He was 40 years old, gray before his time from decades of Atlantic sailing, and he carried in his head a map of the world that was wrong in almost every important detail. He believed the ocean ahead of him was narrow, perhaps 2,400 miles to the eastern shores of Asia. He was off by nearly 10,000 miles. And yet, by the sheerest accident of geography, by the intervention of two unknown continents that lay exactly where he calculated Asia should be, Christopher Columbus would reach land in 33 days and change the history of every people on Earth. Born in Genoa around 1451, the son of a wool weaver who smelled of lanolin and worked long hours at the loom, Columbus had gone to sea young. Some accounts suggest he made his first voyage at the age of 14, sailing along the Ligurian coast of northwestern Italy in the coastal trade that defined the economy of that rocky, sea-facing city. Genoa in the 15th century was a republic of merchants and adventurers, a place where the sea was not a barrier but a highway, and where a clever man of low birth who possessed both intelligence and physical courage could rise through the hierarchy of commerce and navigation. Columbus absorbed that culture completely. He was a mariner before he was anything else, and the sea shaped him, giving him endurance, practical ingenuity, an acute sensitivity to weather and wind, and an appetite for the horizon that never left him. By the time he settled in Lisbon in the late 1470s and married Filipa Perestrelo e Moniz, the daughter of a prominent Portuguese navigator, Columbus had sailed farther and seen more than most men of his generation. He had been to England and Ireland, where the gray northern seas were a different creature entirely from the blue Mediterranean of his childhood. He had sailed to Madeira and the Azores, the Portuguese Atlantic islands that pushed the known world westward. He had voyaged down the coast of West Africa as far as the Gold Coast, and he had noted the currents and winds with the focused attention of a man who understood that the ocean was a system with patterns, not a chaos of arbitrary forces. All of this experience fed into the obsession forming in his mind that the Earth was smaller than the authorities claimed, that Asia was larger and closer than the maps showed, and that a ship sailing steadily west from the shores of Europe could reach the Orient in a matter of weeks. What Columbus set in motion was the most consequential act of navigation in the history of the world, not because he was the greatest sailor who ever lived, though he was extraordinary, and not because his geography was correct, it was spectacularly wrong, but because the encounter his ships initiated between the Old World and the New began a transformation so total, so sweeping, so irreversible, that the world before and after 1492 must be understood as two fundamentally different places. Civilizations would fall. Diseases would sweep across continents. Crops that had grown in the soil of the Americas for millennia, the potato, the tomato, the sweet potato, maize, would eventually feed hundreds of millions in Europe and Asia. And the horror of the transatlantic slave trade, one of the greatest crimes in human history, would follow directly in the wake of those three small ships.
This is the story of how it happened. It is a story of obsession and courage, of navigational genius and catastrophic miscalculation, of wonder and darkness in equal measure, a story that cannot be told with simple admiration or simple condemnation,
because it contains both heroism and atrocity in proportions that resist easy moral resolution. It is the story of a man who refused to accept the limits of the known world and sailed into the unknown with a certainty that was both his greatest strength and his deepest flaw. He died convinced he had reached Asia, when he had, in fact, accomplished something far more momentous. He had connected two halves of the human world that had been separated for approximately 10,000 years, since the rising seas at the end of the last ice age submerged the land bridge between Siberia and Alaska and severed forever the overland connection between the old world and the new. The separation of those two worlds over 10 millennia had produced a divergence of stunning depth and complexity. On one side of the Atlantic, in Europe, Asia, and Africa, civilizations had risen and fallen, exchanging ideas and technologies and diseases and agricultural crops across the vast interconnected web of the Afro-Eurasian landmass. The wheel, iron metallurgy, written alphabets, gunpowder, and the domesticated horse had all spread and evolved across that connected world, passing from culture to culture through the mechanisms of trade, conquest, and migration. The great empires of China, Rome, Persia, and the Islamic caliphates had shaped and reshaped one another across centuries of contact, competition, and occasional catastrophic collision. The Black Death of the 14th century, traveling along the Silk Road from Central Asia to the Mediterranean in the bodies of infected rodents and the fleas that fed on them, had killed perhaps a third of the population of Europe and demonstrated how completely the fates of distant peoples had become intertwined. On the other side of the Atlantic, in complete isolation, the peoples of the Americas had followed their own entirely separate trajectory of development. They had built the city of Tenochtitlan, capital of the Aztec Empire, which in 1492 was one of the largest cities in the world, larger than London, larger than Seville, larger than any city Columbus had ever seen. They had constructed the extraordinary stonework of Machu Picchu and the road system of the Inca Empire, which stretched more than 20,000 miles along the spine of the Andes. They had developed sophisticated agricultural systems, elaborate religious traditions, intricate calendrical calculations, and systems of communication that served the needs of complex imperial societies. They had done all of this without the wheel for transportation, without iron metallurgy, without the horse, not because they were less capable, but because the circumstances of geography and available resources had led their development down a different path. The two worlds were not a developed world and an undeveloped world. They were two different worlds, each fully developed in its own terms. Columbus's crossing brought those two worlds into contact with consequences that neither side could have foreseen or prevented. For the peoples of the Americas, the contact was an unmitigated catastrophe, a demographic, cultural, and spiritual destruction of almost incomprehensible scale, driven primarily by epidemic disease, but amplified enormously by conquest, enslavement, and the systematic dismantling of indigenous societies. For the peoples of the Old World, the consequences ranged from the genuinely beneficial, new crops, new medicines, new materials, to the profoundly criminal, the Atlantic slave trade. The world that exists today, in all its complexity, in inequality and interconnection, is the world that October 12, 1492, created.
Chapter 1. The Obsession. A dream born in the wrong numbers. Christopher Columbus had been wrong about the size of the world for more than a decade before he ever got a chance to test his theory, and the stubbornness with which he clung to his error was itself a kind of genius.
He was born in Genoa, Italy, around 1451, the son of a wool weaver, and he went to sea young. By the time he settled in Lisbon in the late 1470s and married into a family of Portuguese mariners, he had sailed as far north as England and Ireland and as far south as the Gold Coast of Africa. He had studied the available geographical literature with an intensity that bordered on obsession, and from that study he had emerged with a conviction so powerful that it would sustain him through 7 years of rejection and humiliation. The Earth was smaller than the geographers claimed, Asia was larger, and therefore the westward route from Europe to the Orient was achievable by a sailing ship within a reasonable number of weeks at sea. He annotated his copies of Marco Polo's account of Asia with hundreds of marginal notes feeding directly into his theory. He studied the works of the ancient geographers with the discriminating eye of a man looking for support for a predetermined conclusion, not dishonestly, but with the selective focus of the true believer, weighing the sources that confirmed his theory more heavily than those that contradicted it. Pierre Dailly's Imago Mundi, published in 1410, was perhaps the single most important text in his intellectual formation, synthesizing the available geographical knowledge of the age with optimistic estimates of oceanic distances. His annotated copy survives, and the marginalia tell the story of a mind building a case, year by year, annotation by annotation, for the greatest gamble of the age. The central error in Columbus's calculations was a compounding of smaller errors that together produced a conclusion wildly at variance with reality. The Greek geographer Eratosthenes had calculated the circumference of the Earth at approximately 25,000 miles in the 3rd century BCE, and his calculation was essentially correct. Columbus rejected this and preferred the smaller estimates of the Arab geographer Alfraganus, but made a critical mistake. Alfraganus had used the Arabic mile, which is longer than the Roman mile Columbus assumed in his calculations. This single unit of measurement error shrank his mental ocean significantly. He then incorporated the calculations of the Florentine geographer Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who estimated the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan at roughly 3,000 miles. The actual distance is closer to 12,500 miles. Columbus's most optimistic estimate was 2,400 miles. Every competent geographer who reviewed his proposal identified precisely this flaw. They were right. The obsession was not merely intellectual. Columbus came to believe, with an intensity that deepened over the years of rejection, that God had chosen him specifically and personally to open the Western Sea Road. He read the book of Isaiah as a direct prophetic reference to his own mission. He believed the wealth he would bring back from the Orient would fund the final crusade to recover Jerusalem from Muslim rule. This was not cynical piety deployed to impress monarchs. He genuinely believed it. And the belief gave him an unshakable sense of divine mandate that made rejection bearable, that transformed every humiliation into a test of faith rather than evidence of failure, that kept him pressing forward through 7 years of doors closed in his face.
He was wrong on every count. The Greek geographer Eratosthenes had calculated the circumference of the Earth at approximately 25,000 miles, some 17 centuries earlier, and his calculation was essentially correct.
Columbus rejected this figure and preferred the much smaller estimates of the Arab geographer Alfraganus, which he further misinterpreted by applying a longer Arabic mile to a calculation that assumed a shorter Roman mile, a compounding of errors that shrank his mental ocean to something a wooden ship could realistically cross. He also incorporated the calculations of Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, who had estimated the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan at roughly 3,000 miles. The actual distance is closer to 12,500 miles. Every competent geographer who reviewed his proposal told him it was wrong. They were right. Columbus ignored them and pressed forward. The panel of experts appointed by King João II of Portugal to evaluate Columbus's proposal in 1484 were sophisticated men with practical knowledge of maritime geography, and they saw through his arithmetic immediately. They identified the crucial flaw. Columbus had significantly underestimated the size of the Earth and the distance to Asia, and the voyage he proposed was physically impossible for ships of the 15th century. They were correct in their analysis, and they rejected his proposal on sound scientific grounds. The irony that echoes across the centuries is perfect and pitiless. The experts were right about the ocean, but wrong about the outcome, because no one on either side knew that a continent, two continents, lay waiting in the space where Columbus had calculated Asia to be. His first pitch to King João II ended in rejection, and Columbus took it badly. He moved to Spain in 1485, a widower by then. His wife Felipa had died, leaving him with their young son Diego, and began the grinding work of lobbying the court of Castile and Aragon. He haunted the corridors of power in Córdoba and Seville, presenting his case to anyone who would listen, surviving on the charity of monasteries and the occasional patronage of interested nobles. He was not an easy man to be around. He was intensely proud, quick to take offense, possessed of a certainty of his own rightness that could shade from impressive to insufferable, depending on the patience of the listener. He supported himself by drawing and selling maps, a skill his years at sea had given him. He had a relationship with a Córdoba woman named Beatriz Enriquez de Arana. They were never married, but she bore him a son, Ferdinand, in 1488. In the margins of his life, amid the waiting and the rejection, he was also a father, a sometime lover, a man with domestic complications as ordinary as anyone else's. It was the fall of Granada in January 1492 that finally changed everything. With the Reconquista complete and the Catholic monarchs flush with triumph and political energy, Luis de Santangel argued the case for Columbus with fresh urgency, and this time the monarchs listened. The terms Columbus demanded were extraordinary, and the monarch's willingness to grant them suggests they believed privately that he was probably going to fail and the titles would never need to be honored. The psychological portrait of Columbus in these years of rejection is of a man walking a very narrow line between greatness and madness, between inspired vision and pathological delusion. The distinguishing factor, the thing that separates the visionary from the merely deluded, is the outcome. Columbus happened to be right about one crucial thing, that the westward route was navigable. He was wrong about almost everything else. And the combination of a correct intuition about navigability with spectacularly incorrect calculations about distance is perhaps the most extraordinary example in the history of exploration of a right conclusion reached for precisely the wrong reasons.
His first pitch was to King João II of Portugal around 1484, and it was rejected by a committee of experts who identified precisely the flaw in his arithmetic. He moved to Spain in 1485, a widower now, trailing his young son Diego, and spent 7 years haunting the corridors of power in Castile and Aragon, presenting his case to anyone who would listen.
The wandering Spanish court, which moved between Córdoba, Seville, Salamanca, and a dozen other cities as the demands of the Reconquista and royal administration required, meant that Columbus was perpetually in motion, following the monarchs from city to city, seeking audiences, cultivating contacts, managing the perpetual anxiety of a man whose entire future depended on the favorable decision of people whose attention was always directed elsewhere. The monasteries of Andalusia played a crucial role in Columbus's survival during these years of waiting. The Franciscan monastery of La Rábida, near Palos de la Frontera, was particularly important. Its prior, Fray Juan Pérez, had once been confessor to Queen Isabella and retained influence at court, and he became one of Columbus's most effective advocates. It was at La Rábida that Columbus left his son Diego during periods when he was traveling to court, and the monastery's library gave him access to geographical and theological texts that fed his developing sense of divine mission. The Franciscans, with their tradition of evangelical enthusiasm and their long history of missionary activity at the frontiers of the Christian world, were natural allies for a man who framed his geographical project as an act of Christian service. He was rejected twice by royal commissions. He approached the Duke of Medina Sidonia, one of the wealthiest and most powerful nobles in Castile, and was rejected. He tried the Duke of Medinaceli, who showed initial interest before concluding that a project of such magnitude required royal backing, and passed Columbus back to the court. He reportedly sent a proposal to King Henry VII of England through his brother Bartolomeo, who had made the long journey to London on Christopher's behalf, and was rejected there as well. He made inquiry at the court of France. Everywhere he went, the answer was the same. The distances were too great, the evidence too thin, the rewards too speculative. A lesser man would have abandoned the project after the first rejection, or the second, or certainly the fifth. Columbus did not abandon it. He could not. The project had ceased to be a career ambition and become something closer to a calling, a vocation in the religious sense of the word, a task assigned to him by providence and not negotiable with any merely human authority. Through years of disappointment, he maintained his conviction with a rigidity that impressed some and irritated many. Supplemented by a growing sense of divine mandate, Columbus believed deeply and literally that God had chosen him to open the Western Sea Road, that he was fulfilling a prophecy written in Isaiah, that the wealth he brought back would fund the final crusade to recover Jerusalem. This was not cynical posturing. He believed it, and it gave him an unshakable psychological armor against defeat. In the dark periods between rejections, and there must have been dark periods, long weeks of silence and poverty and doubt, what sustained him was not merely ambition or stubbornness, but the profound conviction of a man who believes himself to be acting out a divine script. Whatever doubt a rational observer might bring to the project, Columbus had insulated himself from it completely by the time the monarchs finally gave him their answer. The psychological portrait of Columbus in these years of rejection is of a man walking a very narrow line between greatness and madness, between inspired vision and pathological delusion. The distinguishing factor, the thing that separates the visionary from the merely deluded, is the outcome. Columbus happened to be right about one crucial thing, that the westward route was navigable. He was wrong about almost everything else. And the combination of a correct intuition about navigability with spectacularly incorrect calculations about distance is perhaps the most extraordinary example in the history of exploration of a right conclusion reached for precisely the wrong reasons.
The change in fortune came in 1492, and it came in a rush. In January, the last Muslim stronghold in Spain, the magnificent Alhambra Palace complex of Granada, fell to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella,
completing the Reconquista, the 700-year Christian reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula. The Catholic monarchs, flush with triumph and suddenly possessed of administrative bandwidth they had not had while the Granada campaign consumed their attention and resources, reconsidered Columbus's proposal. The decisive advocate was Luis de Santangel, the royal chancellor, who argued passionately in a private meeting with Isabella that the potential reward vastly outweighed the relatively modest risk. Santangel's argument was essentially that Columbus was asking for very little: a few ships, modest provisions, a handful of titles that would cost the crown nothing if the voyage failed, and would be easily honored from the new revenues if it succeeded. The downside was the loss of 2 or 3 small vessels and their crews. The upside was the possibility of a direct sea route to the wealth of Asia, spices, silks, gold, that would transform Spain's commercial position in Europe overnight. Isabella famously offered to pledge her jewels as collateral for the expedition's costs, a gesture that became legendary, though perhaps not entirely accurate in its details. In the event, Santangel himself arranged most of the financing through his network of Genoese and Florentine banking contacts, and the total cost of the expedition came to approximately 2 million maravedis, the equivalent of perhaps $100,000 in modern purchasing power, a remarkably modest sum for an enterprise that would reshape the world. In April 1492, the capitulations of Santa Fe were signed in the recently conquered city of Granada, a location rich with symbolism, as if the triumphant reconquest of Iberia were directly authorizing the conquest of a new world. The terms Columbus had negotiated were extraordinary by any standard of the age. He was granted the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, with all the privileges and perquisites of that rank, hereditary in his family. He was granted the hereditary governorship and viceroyship over any and all islands and mainland territories he might discover, the right to administer them in the name of the crown, with a degree of autonomy that essentially made him a viceroy of whatever he found. And he was granted 1/10 of all revenues from those territories: gold, silver, pearls, gems, spices, and all other commodities of commercial value. These were the terms of a man who expected to fail, negotiating with monarchs who privately shared that expectation. The extravagance of the concessions reflects the combination of Columbus's extraordinary boldness as a negotiator and the monarch's genuine belief that they were granting titles and percentages that would never become real obligations. Columbus left Granada and went directly to Palos de la Frontera, carrying the royal warrant that authorized him to requisition 2 caravels and their crews from the town, a penalty imposed on Palos for some unspecified offense against the crown, making the ships effectively free to the expedition. He arrived at Palos in May 1492, and the 3 months between his arrival and the departure on August 3rd were consumed by the practical business of fitting out ships, loading provisions, and recruiting men willing to sail west into waters no European had ever crossed. The Pinzon brothers, Martín Alonso and Vicente Yáñez, were the key to the crew recruitment. Without their local authority and personal networks, Columbus might have sailed with a skeleton crew of men with nowhere else to go. With them, he sailed with a company of competent professional mariners who understood what seamanship demanded and were capable of meeting that demand even in the most extreme conditions the Atlantic could produce. The entire period from the signing of the capitulations to the departure of Palos took less than 4 months. After 7 years of rejection, the machinery of the enterprise moved with extraordinary speed once royal authorization had been granted, as if the energy of years of frustration were suddenly converted into kinetic motion, driving the preparation of the fleet with an urgency that felt almost frantic to those watching from the outside.
Chapter 2: 3 ships and 90 men. The fleet of the unknown. The fleet that assembled in the port of Palos de la Frontera in the summer of 1492 was, by any objective measure, a modest instrument for the transformation of the world. 3 small ships, somewhere between 86 and 90 men, provisions calculated for perhaps a month at sea, packed into the holds in the form of ship's biscuit, salted meat and fish, aged cheese, dried legumes, wine stored in sealed casks, olive oil in earthenware jars, vinegar used both as a preservative and a crude antiseptic, and fresh water in wooden barrels that would slowly taint over the weeks ahead. The whole venture cost approximately the equivalent of a small warship, hardly a ruinous investment for a kingdom that had just completed the conquest of Granada. And yet, in those 3 hulls and those few dozen men lay the mechanism for an encounter that would reshape every continent on Earth. The flagship was the Santa María, a nau or carrack of approximately 100 tons burden, larger and more heavily built than her 2 companions, suited to the carrying of cargo and the accommodation of the admiral's party, but slower and less agile than what a pure exploring vessel would ideally have been. Her length was perhaps 70 feet on deck, her beam perhaps 25 feet at the widest point. She carried 3 masts, a large square-rigged foremast and mainmast, and a lateen-rigged mizzenmast at the stern, and could make perhaps 5 or 6 knots in favorable conditions. Columbus commanded her personally and lived aft in the stern cabin, where he kept his instruments, a quadrant, a compass, an astrolabe, his charts, his journals, and his books. Juan de la Cosa, who would later draw the first known map of the Americas, served as master and owner of the Santa María. She would not survive the voyage. The second ship was the Pinta, a caravel of 60 to 70 tons, commanded by Martin Alonso Pinzon of Palos, a wealthy, experienced, and locally respected ship owner whose practical authority and crew recruitment connections were arguably as essential to the expedition as Columbus' vision itself. The caravel was the characteristic vessel of Portuguese and Spanish oceanic exploration, lighter, faster and more maneuverable than the carrack, capable of sailing closer to the wind and navigating shallow coastal waters. The Pinta had been partially refitted before the voyage, her rudder was repaired in the Canary Islands, and she carried a crew of perhaps 26 men under Pinzon's energetic and often independent-minded command. The Pinta was the fastest of the 3 vessels, and it was from her deck that the first sight of the Americas was cried on the morning of October 12, 1492. The third and smallest ship was the Niña, properly Santa Clara, a caravel of 50 to 60 tons, commanded by Martin's younger brother, Vicente Yáñez Pinzon. She was the most seaworthy of the 3, the most maneuverable in difficult conditions, and she proved her qualities repeatedly during the storms of the return voyage. Before the crossing in the Canary Islands, the Niña was re-rigged from her original lateen configuration to square sails, more suitable for the expected downwind passage across the trade wind belt of the Atlantic, a modification that proved its worth many times over. The Niña would ultimately carry Columbus home to Spain when everything else had gone wrong. The Santa María wrecked on a reef, the Pinta separated by storm, and the admiral of the ocean sea clinging to the smallest vessel of his fleet as the February Atlantic tried to swallow them all.
The crew of the 3 ships was a far cry from the myth of convicts and criminals pressed into service against their will, a legend that grew up around the voyage in the centuries after Columbus' death and served various narrative purposes. In reality, most were professional sailors from Palos de la Frontera and the surrounding region of Andalusia, recruited through the Pinzon brothers' extensive local networks,
men who worked the sea for a living and understood its demands with the practical competence of the experienced professional. They included pilots capable of celestial navigation, skilled, able-bodied seamen who could handle a vessel in heavy weather, a surgeon for medical emergencies, a notary to document the legal formalities of any discoveries, several royal officials, and at least one man whose specific skills tell us everything we need to know about what Columbus believed he would find at the end of the voyage. That man was Luis de Torres, a Jewish convert to Christianity, a converso, who spoke Arabic and Hebrew in addition to Spanish. He was brought along because Columbus genuinely, practically, literally expected to need a translator to communicate with the Great Khan of China or the officials of the Japanese court, and Arabic was the diplomatic language of the eastern trade routes. Torres's presence was not decorative or symbolic, it was functional, a logistical preparation for a specific anticipated event. When that event, the arrival at the court of the Great Khan, failed to materialize, and when Torres was instead sent inland on Cuba to make contact with what Columbus presumed was the Chinese mainland, he returned with no imperial envoys but with the remarkable report of a people who smoked the dried leaves of a plant through a tube inserted in the nostril. It was the first recorded European description of tobacco. Torres's Arabic and Hebrew were, in the event, entirely useless for communication with the Taíno. Columbus carried a letter of introduction from the royal monarchs, addressed in deliberately vague terms to any sovereign he might encounter, a diplomatic document of magnificent absurdity when one considers that the monarchs who signed it had no idea who might receive it, whether that recipient might read Spanish or Latin, or indeed whether such a recipient existed at all. There were sailors from Portugal and from Italy, as well as the Spanish majority. There were men from different social strata. There was a physician and a surgeon. Their competence would be tested beyond any peacetime expectation. Most would rise to meet the test. Martín Alonso Pinzón deserves particular attention, for history has allowed Columbus to overshadow him almost completely, and this is an injustice born of the accidents of documentation. Pinzón was not a supporting actor in Columbus's drama. He was the man who made the physical execution of the voyage possible. He was wealthy, respected, experienced in oceanic sailing, and his personal authority in Palos was the crucial factor in transforming Columbus's project from a plan on paper to a fleet actually crewed and provisioned. When Columbus arrived in Palos with the royal warrant in the spring of 1492 and found the local population deeply skeptical of the enterprise, it was Pinzón who stood up and vouched for the voyage, persuading men he knew personally to sign on for waters they had never sailed. He put his own ships and his own reputation on the line. He deserved a share of the fame that history gave almost entirely to the admiral. He died of illness within days of returning to Spain, before the controversy between his version of events and Columbus's could become public.
Martín Alonso Pinzón deserves particular attention in any honest accounting of the first voyage, for history has allowed Columbus to overshadow him almost completely, and this overshadowing is not merely an injustice to one man, but a distortion of the historical record that has shaped how the entire enterprise is understood and remembered. Pinzón was not a supporting actor in Columbus's drama, a local operative who provided ships and men and then stepped back to let the great visionary take the stage. He was a co-author of the expedition in every practical sense, and in the specific matter of making the voyage possible in the summer of 1492, his contribution was arguably more decisive than Columbus's own.
He was from Palos de la Frontera, the port from which the fleet departed, and he belonged to one of its most prominent maritime families. He had sailed the Atlantic, the Guinea coast at minimum, and possibly further, and his practical experience of oceanic navigation was extensive. He was wealthy enough to own ships and employ sailors, respected enough that his personal endorsement could persuade skeptical men to risk their lives on a dangerous enterprise, and experienced enough to evaluate Columbus's proposal on its maritime merits rather than simply deferring to the admiral's authority. When the Royal Commission that reviewed Columbus's proposal in 1490 or 1491 rejected it, Pinzon was among those who heard the arguments and eventually concluded, despite the Commission's skepticism, that the enterprise was worth attempting. His conversion to the project was essential, not because he had special geographical knowledge that the Commission lacked, but because his social authority in Palos was the lever that moved the expedition from possibility to reality. The friction between Pinzon and Columbus was present from early in the voyage and grew sharper as the weeks at sea accumulated. Pinzon commanded the Pinta independently. As the commander of a separate vessel, he had his own authority over his ship and crew, and he exercised that authority in ways that Columbus found infuriating. The most dramatic instance was Pinzon's independent departure from the fleet in late November 1492, when he apparently concluded that gold lay in a direction Columbus was not pursuing and simply sailed off without permission, leaving the admiral with 2 ships for several weeks while Pinzon explored the northeastern coast of Hispaniola on his own. Columbus recorded his fury at this conduct with unusual bluntness in his journal. He had harsh words for Pinzon's greed and insubordination. But when the Pinta rejoined the fleet in January 1493, the reunion was necessarily cordial on the surface. They needed each other to get home. Pinzon's version of the voyage, what he had seen, what he had concluded, what his contribution had been, died with him. He arrived back in Palos on March 15, 1493, the same day as Columbus, already gravely ill with a disease that may have been dysentery or syphilis or the simple accumulated toll of the crossing on a man who was already in poor health. He died within days, probably at his family home in Palos, before he could be received at court, before he could give a public account of his experience, before any competing narrative could complicate the story that Columbus was already telling. History, which records what the survivors say, recorded Columbus's version. Pinzon's version was lost. The injustice is irreparable. We cannot recover what he might have said, but he can at least be acknowledged, and the acknowledgement changes the story. The voyage to America was not the achievement of one solitary visionary. It was the product of a partnership, unequal in ambition and authority, but essential in its complementary components. Columbus's obsessive certainty providing the motivation, Pinzon's practical authority providing the means.
Chapter 3. Into the Unknown, the Atlantic Crossing.
They departed Palos at dawn on the 3rd of August, 1492. Columbus had attended Mass the night before at the Church of St. George in Palos, and the crew had made their confessions and received communion in the manner prescribed by the Church before any significant voyage. The ships moved down the Rio Tinto in the gray light of early morning, past the marshes and the reed beds where the river met the sea, and turned their bows southwest toward the open Atlantic. The people of Palos watched from the shore in whatever mixture of pride and dread that such moments produce. Many would not see their man again for 7.5 months. Some would never see them again at all.
The departure on August 3, 1492, was itself an event weighted with historical symbolism that Columbus could not have anticipated. The previous day, August 2, 1492, had been the deadline set by the Spanish crown for the expulsion of all Jews from Spain who refused to convert to Christianity. The Alhambra Decree, signed in the same month as the capitulations of Santa Fe, had set in motion the largest forced migration in the history of medieval Iberia. Tens of thousands of Jewish families were leaving the country on exactly the same tides that bore Columbus's fleet out of the river. The convergence of these two events, one that would open a new world, one that would close a community's connection to their ancient homeland, was not noticed or remarked upon at the time. It required the perspective of centuries to become visible as the complex historical irony it represents. The stop in the Canary Islands lasted from early August to the 6th of September, nearly a month of repairs, provisioning, and preparation. The Pinta's rudder, which had developed serious problems on the first leg of the voyage, was repaired and secured. Columbus suspected deliberate sabotage by the rudder's owner, who had been conscripted into the expedition against his will. The Niña was re-rigged from her original lateen configuration to square sails, more suitable for the expected downwind run, a modification that required pulling down the existing rigging and purchasing new yards and sails in the Canaries. Fresh provisions were taken aboard, water casks were refilled, and then on the morning of September 6, 1492, the fleet stood out of the harbor of San Sebastián de la Gomera on the western edge of the Canaries, aimed their bows due west, and left the last European land behind them. The ocean opened ahead like a plain without end. Columbus's choice of route was a stroke of navigational genius that would define the pattern of transatlantic sailing for the next 4 centuries. Rather than attempting to cross directly from Spain, where the prevailing westerly winds would have blown relentlessly against him, he first sailed south to the latitude of the Canary Islands, approximately 28 degrees north, where the northeast trade winds blew steadily and reliably from behind, pushing the fleet westward at a consistent pace. The trade wind belt in the North Atlantic is one of the most predictable weather systems on Earth. A mariner who finds it finds a highway. Columbus found it by a combination of prior knowledge and the excellent judgment to trust that knowledge completely. For the first weeks of the crossing, the voyage was almost serene. The journal records an atmosphere more like pleasant cruising than desperate exploration during those first days at sea. Fair skies, warm temperatures, steady winds filling the canvas with a sound like deep breathing, the surface of the ocean brilliant and calm. Columbus wrote that the weather was like April in Andalusia, and the observation carries the weight of a man genuinely surprised by the benevolence of an ocean he had expected to be hostile. Every day westward was a day further into the unknown, and the beauty of those first weeks made the unknown seem briefly manageable.
Columbus's choice of route was a stroke of navigational genius that would define the pattern of transatlantic sailing for the next 4 centuries. Rather than attempting to cross directly from Spain, where the prevailing westerly winds would have blown relentlessly against him, he first sailed south to the latitude of the Canary Islands, approximately 28 degrees north, where the northeast trade winds blew steadily and reliably from behind, pushing the fleet westward at a consistent pace. The trade wind belt of the North Atlantic, generated by the interaction of the subtropical high-pressure systems with the rotation of the Earth, is one of the most predictable weather systems on the planet. A mariner who finds it has found a highway.
Columbus found it, and for the first weeks of the crossing, the voyage was almost serene. The navigation itself was a daily practice of multiple complementary methods, none of them precise by modern standards, but together capable of maintaining a course with sufficient accuracy to keep a fleet on track across 2,000 miles of open ocean. Dead reckoning was the primary tool. Columbus tracked the ship's speed by means of a chip log and combined this with a compass heading and an estimate of the time elapsed to calculate a position. He used a quadrant and an astrolabe to measure the altitude of the North Star and the Sun, giving him latitude determinations that could be cross-checked against his dead reckoning position. None of these methods could give him his longitude. The determination of east-west position at sea would remain insoluble for another 2.5 centuries until the invention of the marine chronometer. But for the purposes of the Atlantic crossing, latitude control and consistent compass heading were sufficient. The journal records an atmosphere more like pleasant cruising than desperate exploration during the first weeks. Fair skies, warm temperatures, steady winds filling the canvas with a sound like deep breathing, the surface of the ocean brilliant and calm. Columbus wrote that the weather was like April in Andalusia. The Sargasso Sea, that strange, still, golden-brown expanse of floating seaweed that spreads across the central Atlantic, caused brief alarm when the ships first entered it. Sailors who had never seen it feared that the weed might entangle the hulls. Columbus navigated through the Sargasso with calm authority, noting the seaweed in his journal, but refusing to allow the crew's anxiety to slow the voyage. His actual navigation was remarkably accurate given the tools available to him. Modern reconstructions of his route suggest that he crossed the Atlantic in approximately a straight-line path at the latitude of the trade winds, making good time and maintaining a heading that brought him directly to the Bahamas. The ocean was his natural element, and in it he was supremely competent in a way that his later career as a colonial administrator would reveal he was not on land. The sea asked of him exactly what he had spent 40 years learning to provide: attention, patience, physical endurance, practical judgment, and the ability to hold a course through uncertainty without flinching. Each sunrise brought the fleet further from everything they had known, and closer to something none of them could name or imagine. The weeks passed with a regularity that was both reassuring and unnerving. The fleet maintained its heading. The crew watched the horizon and counted the days. Each sunrise brought them further from everything they had known, and closer to something none of them could name or imagine. The silence of the deep ocean pressed on the mind with a weight that some men find liberating and others find crushing. And the 33 days that separated departure from landfall were experienced differently by every man aboard, according to his own inner resources.
But the psychological pressure was building beneath the surface calm. Each day, the crew kept careful count of the distance covered, and each day that count grew more alarming. Columbus was not entirely honest with his men about how far they had traveled. He kept 2 logs, one accurate record for his own navigation and one deliberately underreported account that he showed the crew, designed to prevent them from grasping the true extent of their penetration into the unknown ocean. The deception was systematic and calculated. Columbus understood that his most fragile cargo was not the provisions in the hold, but the morale of 80-some men who had never been this far from land, whose willingness to continue was the only thing standing between a successful landfall and a mutiny. The question of Columbus's deception has been complicated by the fact that the original journal does not survive. What we have is an abstract made by Bartolomé de las Casas in the 16th century, subject to a century and a half of scholarly debate about which passages to trust. But the broad picture is clear.
Columbus managed information about the voyage's progress with deliberate care, driven by fear of what his crew might do if they fully understood how far from Spain they were. By early October, the management was failing. The crew's anxiety had curdled into something close to despair, and despair in a wooden ship on an empty ocean can become mutiny with terrifying speed. Not the dramatic, sword-drawn mutiny of fiction, but the quieter, more dangerous mutiny of collective refusal, where men simply stop following orders, stop believing in the authority of the figure at the helm. Columbus confronted this reality with a mixture of persuasion and firmness, promising to turn back if land was not found within a few more days, while simultaneously watching the ocean for any sign that might restore confidence. Then the ocean itself began to speak. Branches floated past the hull, still green, still bearing berries, which meant land was near enough to have supplied them recently. A cane was found, and a stick that appeared to have been shaped by a human hand. The smell was on the air, that unmistakable, sweet, humid, living smell of vegetation and soil, so completely different from the salt emptiness of open ocean. And birds, not the storm petrels of the open Atlantic, but land birds flying westward in flocks. Columbus altered course slightly southward to follow them. On the night of October 11th, Columbus thought he saw on the western horizon a faint and flickering point of light, like a torch, he wrote, moving up and down in the way something carried by a person walking on uneven ground would move. He called another officer to confirm it. The officer saw something, or thought he did. No other member of the crew confirmed the sighting. Columbus logged it anyway, and later claimed the reward offered to the first man to sight land. Rodrigo de Triana, the sailor on the Pinta who cried out "Tierra" at 2 in the morning of October 12th, received nothing. Whether this was just or unjust depends on whether Columbus genuinely saw a light on the night of the 11th. History has not resolved the question. Columbus took the money. The ocean had been sending its signals for days before the final crisis. The green branches, the carved stick, the birds, the smell of land on the air, and Columbus had read those signals correctly, adjusting his course southward to follow the bird's flight path. His navigational instinct was working as his authority over the crew was faltering. The two facts coexisted, a commander losing control of his men and a navigator moving with increasing precision toward the landfall that would vindicate everything. In the end, the ocean delivered what Columbus had promised, not because his calculations were correct, but because the world is larger than any single man's errors can encompass, and 2 continents lay waiting precisely where he had placed his faith.
Chapter 4. Tierra, Tierra, the morning that made history. At approximately 2 o'clock in the morning of October 12, 1492, the lookout posted on the forecastle of the Pinta, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, young and sharp-eyed, scanning the darkness ahead with the concentrated attention of a man whose professional reputation depended on what he saw, cried out the 2 words that rewrote the atlas of the world: Tierra, Tierra, land, land. Martin Alonso Pinzon crossed the deck with quick steps to confirm the sighting, stared into the western darkness for a long moment, and fired the signal cannon. The sound rolled across the water with the flat authority of iron and gunpowder and woke the other ships. Sailors tumbled from their hammocks. Men who had been sleeping the exhausted, anxious sleep of the chronically afraid came awake into something they had been waiting 33 days to hear, the sound that meant they were not, after all, going to die alone in the middle of an empty ocean. Dawn came slowly, as it always does when it is most desperately wanted. The hours between the cannon shot and the first gray light of morning were among the most psychologically intense in the history of exploration. A vigil of suspense, with the crew standing at the rail, staring westward into the darkness, watching for the shape that Rodrigo had seen, needing it to be real, unwilling to trust the evidence of one man's eyes in the dark until the sun could confirm it.
and when the dawn came, it revealed a flat green island, perhaps 6 miles long, lush with tropical vegetation, rimmed with white sand beaches, and the characteristic turquoise water of the Bahamas, a shade of blue-green so vivid and so completely unlike anything in the Atlantic or Mediterranean that the men who saw it for the first time described it with the vocabulary of wonder. Columbus named the island San Salvador, Holy Savior, in a gesture of genuine religious gratitude that transcends easy cynicism. He had sailed into the dark for 33 days on nothing but his conviction, and land had risen out of the ocean to meet him. The naming was an act of devotion as much as possession, the acknowledgement of a man who believed literally and completely that God had guided his course. Columbus went ashore with his captains and officers in the ship's boats, carrying the royal standard of Castile and Leon and the green banner of the expedition. He planted the banner in the sand, drew his sword, and formally took possession of the island in the name of the King and Queen of Spain, reciting the legal formula required by Castilian law, the claim of ownership over lands that belonged to people who had no say in the matter, and no knowledge that their world had just been claimed by a distant monarch they had never heard of. The ceremony was solemn and deliberate, everything done by the book of Spanish imperial procedure, and it set the legal and conceptual template for 500 years of European colonialism in the Americas. And while this ceremony was being performed on the beach, the people of the island had come down to see. They came in numbers, men, women, children, drawn by the incomprehensible apparition of 3 enormous floating structures with great white sails, by the sound of the cannon, by the sight of men dressed in layers of cloth and metal in a climate that required nothing of the sort. They were the Taíno people of the Bahamas, and they had never seen a ship, a horse, a wheel, or a sword of iron. They had come to the beach with gifts in their hands. Columbus received the gifts and immediately began calculating what these people could be made to do.
Columbus went ashore with his captains and officers in the ship's boats, carrying the royal standard of Castile and Leon and the green banner of the expedition, bearing an F and a Y for Fernando and Isabel, Ferdinand and Isabella. He planted the banner in the sand, drew his sword, and formally took possession of the island in the name of the King and Queen of Spain. The ceremony was solemn and deliberate, everything done by the book of Castilian imperial procedure. The notary recorded the event, the officers witnessed it, and Columbus, speaking in the formal legal language required by the Capitulaciones de Santa Fe, declared himself admiral of the ocean sea and governor of whatever lands he had found, in the name of their most Catholic majesties. The people of the island had come to the beach in numbers. Columbus's description of them in his journal is one of the most famous passages in the literature of exploration, and it deserves to be read slowly and carefully because it contains, in compressed form, the entire future of the Americas. He describes them as beautiful, well-made, well-proportioned. He notes their skin color, their painted bodies, the minimal or absent clothing. He describes their generosity. They brought gifts of cotton, parrots, small balls of spun thread, and other objects, and gave them freely to the strangers from the ships. He notes that they carried no weapons of iron, and that when he showed them European swords, some grasped the blades by the edge and cut themselves, not knowing what the object was or how it worked. This observation is recorded with apparent sympathy. And then, within the same paragraph, Columbus writes the sentence that casts a shadow over everything that follows. They ought to be good servants and of good understanding. And I believe that they would easily be made Christians, for it appeared to me that they had no religion. He had been on the island for a few hours. He had not exchanged 20 comprehensible words with anyone. He did not speak Taíno. The Taíno did not speak Spanish. The entirety of his communication had been conducted through gesture, pointing,
and the universal grammar of gift exchange. And from this basis of near total ignorance, Columbus had already concluded what these people were for. They were to be servants, they were to be Christians. Their own religion, which was in fact a sophisticated animist tradition centered on carved figures called zemies, on ancestor veneration, on a rich cosmological understanding of the human world and the spirit world, did not exist in Columbus's rendering because it did not resemble the Christianity he understood as the only valid form of religious life. The Taíno of Guanahani were in his mental framework blanks to be written upon, the raw material for a colonial enterprise whose terms he had already negotiated in Santa Fe. The island Columbus called San Salvador is most likely Guanahani, called today Watlings Island or San Salvador in the Bahamas, though the exact identification has been debated by scholars for more than a century, with various candidates proposed and argued over with an intensity disproportionate to the practical significance of the question. What matters is not which precise grain of coral and sand first received Columbus's footstep, but what happened next. The encounter between two worlds that had not known of each other's existence for 10,000 years, mediated by a man who saw what he wanted to see, heard what he wanted to hear, and moved on quickly in search of gold. The Taíno of Guanahani were generous with their time and their information. They pointed south and east and spoke of larger islands, of a place where gold was more plentiful. Columbus's fleet spent only 2 days at San Salvador before setting sail again, southward through the Bahamas, following the directions of the Taíno guides, some taken willingly aboard, others taken by force, toward whatever lay beyond the horizon. The age of exploration, in its most rapacious and consequential form, had begun. And the people who had been on these islands for centuries, who had come to the beach with gifts in their hands, had no way of knowing what those 3 ships at anchor in their harbor represented for their future.
Chapter 5. Among the Islands. Gold, Wonder, and the First Shadows.
The weeks that followed the first landfall were a period of intense and disorienting exploration as Columbus's fleet picked its way through the islands of the Bahamas and then westward toward the larger islands that lay beyond in search of the mainland of Asia, the court of the Great Khan, and above all, gold. The Taíno of Guanahani wore small gold ornaments, nose rings, earrings, pendants, and when Columbus asked, by gesture and mime and the crude vocabulary of pointing, where the gold came from, the Taíno pointed south and west and spoke names that Columbus processed through the filter of his obsession into confirmation of what he already believed. Every name he heard, every direction indicated, every feature of the landscape described through the impossible barrier of mutual linguistic incomprehension, he interpreted as pointing toward Asia, toward the emperor, toward the gold. The Taíno communities Columbus encountered during these weeks of island hopping were not the primitive, pre-civilizational societies that the language of his journal might suggest to a careless reader. They lived in organized towns and villages, in houses built of wooden posts with thatched roofs of palm fronds, sleeping in hammocks, a technology so practical and so elegant that European sailors adopted it almost immediately, and it became the standard sleeping arrangement on sailing vessels for the next several centuries, a direct and persistent cultural exchange that we rarely think about as such. The Taíno cultivated cassava, manioc, the starchy root crop that was their dietary staple, in carefully tended gardens, using agricultural methods developed over centuries to the specific conditions of the Caribbean soils and rainfall patterns. They grew sweet potatoes, maize, peppers, and a variety of squash.
They fished the surrounding reefs and open water with nets, lines, and the remarkable technique of using a remora, a suckerfish that attaches to larger animals, as a living fishing tool, tying a line to the fish and releasing it near a sea turtle or manatee, then hauling in the fish and its captive together. They manufactured cotton textiles of considerable quality and traded them across the islands. They carved wooden objects, canoes, furniture, religious figures, with tools of stone and shell and bone that produced work of real artistic sophistication. Their canoes, some large enough to carry 40 or 50 men, were the primary vehicles of an island trading network that connected the entire Caribbean archipelago in webs of commerce and social relationship that Columbus observed but did not understand, because he was looking at it through the lens of European commerce and could not see it on its own terms. When he recorded that the Taíno traded and moved between islands freely, he interpreted this as evidence of a lack of fixed settlement, a nomadism that implied primitiveness. It was not nomadism. It was a sophisticated maritime culture perfectly adapted to its environment. What struck Columbus most forcefully and most ominously about the Taíno was not their complexity, but their apparent vulnerability. They had no weapons of iron. They did not practice warfare of the organized, systematic, industrial kind that Europeans recognized and respected as a marker of civilizational development. When shown European swords, they grasped the blades by the edge and cut themselves. Columbus recorded this detail with what reads like sympathy, but functions in the logic of the journal as a strategic assessment. A people with no iron weapons and no understanding of what an iron weapon was could be controlled by a very small number of armed Europeans, could be put to work, could be governed, could, in the admiral's words that echo through the centuries with a terrible clarity, be made good servants. He had been on the beach of Guanahani for a few hours. He had not learned a single word of Taíno, and he had already decided what these people were for.
What struck Columbus most forcefully about the Taíno was not their sophistication, but their apparent vulnerability. They had no weapons of iron. They did not, apparently, practice warfare of the kind that Europeans recognized, organized, systematic, and lethal. When Columbus showed them European swords, he recorded that they grasped the blades by the edge, not knowing what they were, and cut themselves. This observation, made with apparent sympathy, was immediately processed by Columbus's calculating mind into a strategic assessment. A people with no iron weapons, who did not know what a sword was, could be controlled, could be made to work, could be governed by a small number of armed Europeans. He also began, on these island voyages, the practice of taking Taíno people aboard his ships without their consent. Some went willingly, drawn by curiosity about the strange vessels and their stranger occupants, young men primarily, who saw in the ships an adventure or an opportunity that their island life did not provide. Others were taken by force, seized by Columbus's crew when they came too close to the ships, or when Columbus decided he needed guides and no volunteers were available. He intended them as living maps, people who could point the way to the next island, the next source of gold, the larger land that must lie ahead, and as potential interpreters, though the communication barrier was so enormous that the Taíno aboard the ships in the first weeks could communicate with the Spanish crew only through gesture, pointing, and the crudest possible improvisation of a shared vocabulary built from nothing, word by painful word, over weeks of forced proximity. Cuba appeared on October 28th, looming out of the southwestern horizon with the unmistakable solidity of a large landmass, a coast that went on and on as the ships sailed along it, that did not resolve into the limited profile of an island, but continued beyond the horizon in both directions.
Columbus was certain beyond any doubt or argument, with the complete certainty of a man who has been certain about everything for years and has finally been proven right about the existence of land, that this was the mainland of Asia, the Chinese coast, the beginning of the Orient. He ordered Luis de Torres, his Arabic-speaking interpreter, to go ashore with a small party and make his way inland to the nearest large city, carrying Columbus's letter of introduction addressed to the emperor. Torres returned several days later with no emperor, no letter of reply, no city, and no Chinese officials of any kind. Only the report of Taíno villages in the interior, a friendly and hospitable people who had never heard of the Great Khan, and the remarkable observation that the local men appeared to smoke the dried leaves of a plant called tobacco through a forked tube inserted in their nostrils, inhaling the smoke deeply and appearing to derive great satisfaction or perhaps mild intoxication from the experience. Columbus noted this in his journal with mild interest and moved on. He was looking for gold and an emperor. He had found neither, and Cuba was beginning to exhaust the possibilities of the theory that had sustained him for a decade. The Carib threat, or rather the Taínos' fear of the Carib people, was a recurring theme of these island explorations. The Taíno repeatedly described, through gesture and evident fear, a people they called the Caniba, or Carib, who raided their islands from the east, capturing people and allegedly consuming them. Columbus processed this information through the lens of Marco Polo's descriptions of the legendary dog-headed people at the edges of the known world, and concluded with characteristic confidence that the Carib were the people of the Great Khan, the Khan's subjects, and that their name was a corruption of Khan. This interpretation was wrong in every particular, but it gave the word Caribbean to the sea, the word cannibal to the English language, and the ideological justification for Spanish slave raiding to those who came after Columbus and needed a legal framework for what they intended to do.
Chapter 6. Christmas Night, Catastrophe and La Navidad. The flagship Santa María struck the reef in the early hours of Christmas morning 1492 while Columbus slept. The fault, as Columbus recorded it in his journal with barely suppressed fury, lay with a cabin boy, the most junior and inexperienced person on the ship, who had been left at the tiller when the helmsman, exhausted after a long watch, handed it off in clear violation of Columbus's explicit standing orders that no inexperienced hand should take the helm at night, especially in coastal waters where reefs and shoals lay hidden beneath the surface of a deceptively calm sea. The boy felt the rudder go slack and the ship begin to ground and called for help. The helmsman came running, Columbus came running, the officers came running, but by the time the crew mobilized with anchors and warping lines to try to pull the ship off the reef, it was too late. The Santa María was hard on the coral, her hull working against the rock with every wave, and she would not come off. The loss of the flagship was a disaster compounded by the specific cruelty of its timing. Christmas Day, 1492, the feast that was supposed to celebrate the birth of the Savior, the religious high point of the year, became instead the day the Admiral of the Ocean Sea stood on the deck of his grounded flagship and watched his command disintegrate around him. Columbus's response to the crisis was organized and practical. He ordered the ship's boats out immediately and directed a systematic salvage operation, pulling the cargo and equipment from the hull before the sea could claim it. The wreck was partly saved, provisions, tools, cannons, personal belongings of the crew, and this salvage was conducted with sufficient efficiency that Columbus was later able to arm and supply a small fort on the shore. That fort was La Navidad, Christmas, named in the bitter irony of the occasion. Its construction used the timber from the wreck of the Santa María herself. The great ship that had carried Columbus across the Atlantic was torn apart and rebuilt as a garrison on the shore of Hispaniola, its planks and beams becoming the walls of the first permanent European settlement in the Americas.
La Navidad was small, a palisaded enclosure with a tower, capable of housing perhaps 40 men, but it was real, and it was armed with cannon from the Santa María, and it had provisions for more than a year. Columbus left 39 men there under the command of Diego de Arana, the cousin of his Córdoba companion Beatriz, with orders to be respectful to the Taíno, to explore the gold sources of the region, and to maintain the alliance with the cacique Guacanagari until Columbus returned with a much larger fleet. What Columbus could not give them was any realistic understanding of what staying behind actually meant. These 39 men were being left in a country they did not know, speaking a language no one around them understood, in a fort built of salvaged planks with a canoe as their only means of communication between the fort and the sea. They had no horses, no reinforcements, no way to send for help if things went wrong, and no reliable knowledge of the Taíno political landscape beyond the immediate vicinity of La Navidad. Guacanagari was friendly, genuinely friendly, not merely politic, and had proved it during the salvage of the Santa María, sending his people out in canoes to help recover the cargo with real energy and effectiveness. But Guacanagari's authority did not extend to all the chieftains of Hispaniola, and the island was large and politically complex in ways that Columbus had not begun to understand. When Columbus sailed from La Navidad on January 4, 1493, heading northeast along the coast before turning east for the long passage home, the 39 men remaining on the beach watched the two small ships diminish on the horizon until they disappeared. They were alone in the Americas. They were the first permanent European settlement in the New World, and they had approximately 11 months to live. When Columbus returned with 17 ships and over 1,000 colonists in November 1493, La Navidad was burned to the ground, and all 39 men were dead.
Before the disaster of the grounding, Hispaniola had appeared to be the most promising land Columbus had found in all his weeks of island exploration. The island was large, perhaps 200 miles across, and its interior, visible from the coast as a series of blue-gray mountain ranges receding into the distance, suggested a complexity of geography and resources that the flat Bahamian islands could not offer. The rivers that drained those mountains ran gold-bearing. The Taíno wore gold ornaments larger and more numerous than anything Columbus had seen in the Bahamas or Cuba. And when he pointed at them and raised his eyebrows in the universal gesture of inquiry, they pointed inland at the mountains and spoke the word Cibao, which Columbus immediately processed through the now familiar mechanism of wishful interpretation as a corruption of Cipangu, Marco Polo's name for Japan. The cacique who held authority over the section of the northern coast where La Navidad was built was Guacanagari, and he was a man of genuine diplomatic sophistication who understood, or intuited, that the strangers from the ships represented both an opportunity and a danger that required careful management. His response to the grounding of the Santa María was exemplary. He sent his people out in canoes immediately, without being asked, to help salvage the cargo, and the assistance was real, organized, and effective, not a token gesture of sympathy, but a sustained operational effort that recovered most of the provisions and equipment from the stricken vessel before the sea could claim them. Columbus was moved by this generosity and recorded it with genuine warmth, writing that there was not a single person in Spain who would have been so liberal, so honest, so trustworthy in an emergency. The praise was sincere, and it reflected a real quality in Guacanagari's character and leadership. It also reflected the calculation of a chieftain who understood that the goodwill of the strange armed men from the ships was worth cultivating. The return voyage began on January 4th, 1493, with 2 ships and approximately 90 men, including at least 7 or 8 Taíno brought aboard as involuntary passengers, people Columbus intended to present to Ferdinand and Isabella as living evidence of his discoveries. The early weeks of the return were troubled by the easterly trade winds that had carried the fleet so easily westward in September. Heading east against those same winds required the ships to beat upwind, making progress by tacking back and forth across the wind direction, covering 2 miles of sea for every mile of eastward progress, wearing the ships and their crews with the relentless physical demand of constant sail handling. Columbus's solution was to sail north first, out of the trade wind belt, looking for the westerly winds that blow at higher latitudes in the North Atlantic, the counterpart to the trade winds that had carried him west, the winds that would carry him east. The strategy was sound, and the winds came eventually, but February 1493 produced the worst weather of the entire voyage. A series of severe Atlantic storms struck the fleet in the open ocean somewhere between the Azores and Portugal, driving the 2 caravels apart in seas so mountainous and winds so violent that Columbus reportedly believed he was going to die. He ordered the crew to draw lots for who would make the pilgrimage to a series of shrines if they survived, a collective vow of thanksgiving that served both the religious and psychological purpose of making survival feel like a conditional promise rather than a forlorn hope. He himself wrote what he called a letter describing his discoveries on pieces of parchment, sealed it in a cask, and threw it overboard, reasoning that if the ship sank, the cask might survive, and his discoveries would be known to the world, even if he was not. The cask has never been found. Columbus survived. The Niña and the Pinta survived, though separately. They were driven apart in the storm and made their final approaches to Spain on divergent courses, the Niña making directly for the Spanish coast, and the Pinta stopping first in the Azores, where the Portuguese governor's attempt to arrest Columbus produced a confrontation of operatic proportions before cooler heads prevailed.
Chapter 7. The Return, Triumph, Controversy, and 2 audiences with kings. The Niña limped into the harbor of Santa María in the Azores on February 18, 1493, battered but intact. The welcome was not warm. The Portuguese governor of the island, acting on the instructions or the paranoid instincts of a Portuguese crown, deeply anxious about whatever Columbus might have found in the western Atlantic, initially arrested Columbus and several of his crew when they went ashore to fulfill one of the vows made during the storms. The governor suspected them of having sailed into waters that the Treaty of Alcózovas of 1479 had assigned to Portugal, and he was not entirely right. The treaty's language was ambiguous enough that the question of whether Columbus's discoveries fell within the Portuguese or Spanish sphere was genuinely contested, and would remain so until the Treaty of Tordesillas settled it in 1494 by drawing a new line through the Atlantic. Columbus was furious at the arrest, with the controlled fury of a man who has just crossed the ocean and is not inclined to be detained by a provincial official on a small island. He produced his royal documents from Ferdinand and Isabella with the manner of a man producing trumps at the end of a long card game, and demanded his men's release. The governor, faced with documentary evidence of the Spanish monarch's authorization and the practical problem that Columbus's ship was still armed and anchored in his harbor, backed down. Columbus took on fresh water and provisions and sailed on toward Spain, stopping briefly in Lisbon after the battered Niña could not make headway against the continuing Atlantic storms in the final push up the Portuguese coast.
The audience with King João II of Portugal in Lisbon was one of the most politically charged private meetings in the history of the age of exploration. João II, who had rejected Columbus's proposal 9 years earlier and had watched the Genoese captain proceed to make the discovery he had declined to fund, received Columbus with the formal courtesy that a reigning monarch extends to the official representative of a neighboring sovereign, and with whatever personal composure it required to receive with grace news that Portugal had allowed to slip through its fingers. The accounts of the meeting describe an atmosphere of thinly veiled tension beneath the diplomatic formalities. João II claimed that the new lands fell within Portugal's sphere under the Treaty of Alcóçovas. Columbus presumably disagreed. The meeting ended without resolution, and the diplomatic crisis it represented would require the intervention of Pope Alexander VI and ultimately the Treaty of Tordesillas to settle. A settlement that, by drawing its line of demarcation through the Atlantic at a point that happened to place the eastern bulge of South America on the Portuguese side, accidentally gave Portugal the legal basis for the colonization of Brazil, a country whose existence neither signatory yet suspected. Columbus arrived back at Palos de la Frontera on the 15th of March, 1493, completing a round voyage of approximately 7.5 months. The Pinta arrived almost simultaneously, having survived the storm and made directly for northern Spain before turning south. Martín Alonso Pinzón, already gravely ill, the accumulated toll of 7 months at sea, possibly compounded by disease acquired in the Caribbean, went directly home to Palos and died within days. He never gave a public account of his version of events. He never had the opportunity to contest Columbus's narrative or claim his share of the glory. He died as he had lived, in the shadow of a man who was better at self-promotion, and history buried him there. The voyage from Palos to Barcelona, where Ferdinand and Isabella were holding court, took several weeks, and during those weeks Columbus composed and sent ahead the letter that would become the most widely circulated news document of the century. He described green and fertile islands, gentle and beautiful peoples, gold to be had in the rivers of Hispaniola, and a sea route to Asia newly opened by Spanish enterprise and divine providence. The letter was published in Barcelona within weeks, in Latin within a month, in multiple European languages within a year. Europe read it and felt the world expand.
Columbus arrived back at Palos de la Frontera on the 15th of March, 1493, completing a round voyage of approximately 7.5 months. The Pinta arrived almost simultaneously, having survived the storm and made directly for Spain. Martín Alonso Pinzón, already gravely ill, went directly home to Palos and died within days. He never gave a public account of his version of events. He never had the opportunity to contest Columbus's narrative or claim his share of the glory. History recorded Columbus's version instead. The reception in Barcelona, where Ferdinand and Isabella were holding court, was the most spectacular public ceremony of Columbus's life. The procession that entered the city was unprecedented in its nature, not a military triumph with prisoners in chains, but something entirely new, a display of the New World itself, carried into the streets of one of Spain's great cities as living proof that the ocean had been crossed. Walking in the procession were 6 surviving Taíno men and women, their bodies painted in the patterns of their culture, wearing the gold ornaments that Spanish eyes had first seen on the beach at Guanahani. On the shoulders of sailors rode parrots, the green and red and blue parrots of the Caribbean, birds so exotic that the crowd lining the streets had never seen anything like them.
Boxes and casks contained gold samples, exotic plants and seeds, unfamiliar spices, cotton textiles, and various objects of material culture completed the display. Columbus was ushered into the throne room and allowed to sit in the presence of the monarchs, a distinction granted to great nobles and virtually no one else, a mark of exceptional honor signaling the magnitude of what he had done. Ferdinand and Isabella rose from their thrones to receive him, another gesture of extraordinary significance, since monarchs did not rise for petitioners, but for equals. Columbus knelt before them and gave his account of the voyage. The monarchs listened, and in the ceremony of that moment, something was formalized, that the world had changed, and that Spain had changed it. He was formally confirmed in all the titles and privileges of the capitulations of Santa Fe, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy and Governor, 1/10 of all revenues in perpetuity. The audience wept with the physical sensation of living inside history. Columbus left Barcelona as the most celebrated man in Spain. His letter, written on the return voyage, circulating in print almost before he reached Barcelona, became the most widely read news document of the 15th century. It went through 9 editions in its first year and was translated into Latin, Italian, German, and eventually most European vernacular languages. The image it created of green and fertile islands beyond the ocean, of beautiful and gentle peoples who would easily become Christians, of gold in the rivers, drove the next wave of exploration and conquest that would follow Columbus's caravels across the Atlantic in the years ahead. Europe read it and felt the world expand. Beyond the ceremony and the glory of Barcelona lay the harder reality of what Columbus had actually returned with. He had brought gold samples, not the vast quantities the letter promised, but enough to demonstrate that gold existed in the new territories. He had brought parrots, plants, and people, 6 surviving Taíno, reduced from the 10 or more taken aboard at various points during the voyage by the deaths that the Atlantic crossing and the months at sea had claimed. He had brought geographical knowledge, rough charts of the island coastlines he had sailed, estimates of distances and positions, a framework for understanding what lay out there in the Western Ocean. And he had brought a claim, a vast, extravagant, legally formalized claim to a governorship and an admiralty and a 1/10 share of revenues that the monarchs had signed in the euphoria of the Reconquista and would spend the next decade trying to limit, constrain, and ultimately revoke. The triumph of Barcelona contained already the seeds of the bitter disappointment that would consume Columbus's final years.
Chapter 8. The Columbian Exchange. 2 worlds collide.
The consequences of October 12, 1492 unfolded over decades and centuries, accumulating into one of the most profound transformations in the history of life on Earth. Historians have given this transformation a name, the Columbian Exchange. It is a name that sounds neutral, almost bureaucratic, and it describes something that was anything but neutral. It was the collision of 2 biological worlds that had been entirely separated for approximately 10,000 years since the last land bridge between Asia and the Americas was submerged by rising seas at the end of the Ice Age. And the consequences of that collision were catastrophic for one side and ultimately transformative for the entire planet. The most lethal cargo that Columbus's ships carried was invisible. It had no weight, took up no space in the hold, required no provisions, and killed more people than all the swords and cannons of the conquest combined. The peoples of the Americas, the Taíno, the Maya, the Aztec, the Inca, and hundreds of other civilizations across 2 continents that together comprised perhaps 50 to 100 million people, had developed in complete biological isolation from the Old World. They had never been exposed to smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, bubonic plague, or any of the dozens of other infectious diseases that had been circulating in Europe, Asia, and Africa for millennia, and that the populations of those regions had developed at least partial immunity to through generations of exposure and natural selection. The immune systems of the American peoples had no defenses whatsoever against these pathogens, not because those immune systems were deficient, they were not, but because immunity to a specific pathogen can only be acquired through exposure to that pathogen, either directly or through generations of ancestors who survived it. The peoples of the Americas had never been exposed. They had no inherited defense, and when the first European ships anchored in Caribbean harbors, the biological clock began ticking. The speed and completeness of the demographic catastrophe that followed is almost beyond human comprehension. Within a generation of Columbus's first landfall, by approximately 1520, the Taíno population of Hispaniola, estimated at somewhere between 250,000 and 1 million people at the time of contact, had been reduced to perhaps a few thousand. By 1550, for all practical purposes, the Taíno as a distinct culture and people had ceased to exist. This was not accomplished primarily by Spanish swords, though the violence of the conquest was real and brutal. It was accomplished primarily by epidemic disease, smallpox, measles, and typhus moving through populations that had no immunity with the speed and totality of fire in dry timber. A village infected one week would be dead or dying the next. Survivors of one epidemic were often too weakened and numerically reduced to maintain the agricultural systems that sustained them, leading to famine on top of disease, creating a cascade of destruction that no individual act of Spanish cruelty could match for sheer lethal efficiency. The numbers, as historians have debated them for a century, remain controversial in their specifics, but broadly consistent in their horror. The pre-contact population of the Western Hemisphere was probably somewhere between 50 and 100 million people. By 1600, a century after Columbus's first voyage, it may have been reduced to 10 million or less. Some estimates are more conservative, some are less, but the broad consensus is that somewhere between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died in the century following European contact, the majority from epidemic disease. This was the largest demographic catastrophe in recorded human history, surpassing the Black Death of the 14th century in absolute numbers and in the speed of its unfolding. It happened largely invisibly, not because no one was watching, but because the dying was so pervasive and so rapid that it preceded the full establishment of European documentary infrastructure in many areas, leaving the dead to lie uncounted and unrecorded in the ruins of the civilizations they had built.
In the other direction, the Americas offered the Old World something that would eventually prove equally transformative in its scale, though over a longer time scale and with results that were, on balance, far more positive for the recipients. The crops that American civilizations had developed over thousands of years of careful agricultural selection were among the most productive, nutritious, and adaptable in the world, the products of millennia of deliberate human intervention in the genomes of wild plants, guided by the accumulated agricultural knowledge of dozens of separate civilizations. The potato is perhaps the single most consequential crop transfer in human history.
Cultivated in the Andes of South America for perhaps 8,000 years, the potato reached Spain in the 1570s and spread slowly through Europe over the following century. Initially regarded with deep suspicion, a member of the nightshade family, its underground tuber struck many Europeans as unwholesome. In Ireland, in the Scottish Highlands, in Germany and Poland and Russia, the potato eventually overcame that suspicion and became the dietary foundation of populations that had been chronically underfed on the grain crops available to them. A single acre of potatoes could feed twice as many people as the same acre under wheat. The caloric density and storability of the potato transformed the food security of Northern and Central Europe, supported a massive population increase in the 18th and 19th centuries, and contributed directly to the labor surplus that fueled the Industrial Revolution. The tomato, initially regarded with even more suspicion, eventually became so thoroughly embedded in Italian, Spanish, and Mediterranean cuisine that it is difficult today to imagine those cuisines without it. Spaghetti with tomato sauce, pizza, the entire tradition of southern Italian cooking as it is understood around the world, depends on a fruit unknown in Italy before the Spanish brought it from the Americas in the 16th century. Maize fed populations across sub-Saharan Africa and southern Europe, becoming the dietary staple of large areas within a century of contact. The sweet potato transformed the food systems of East Asia. Chocolate, tobacco, rubber, quinine, the medicine that made tropical Africa accessible to European colonialism, moved from the Americas to the Old World and changed the material fabric of daily life in ways now so deeply embedded as to be invisible. The plantation economy that the Spanish established in the Caribbean after 1492 was the darkest consequence of the crossing. Sugar cultivation required labor of brutal intensity, sustained through years of harvesting and processing that broke human bodies with systematic efficiency. When the indigenous population of the Caribbean collapsed under the combined weight of disease, forced labor, and violence, the Spanish turned to Africa. The transatlantic slave trade, which, over the course of its 300-year operation, would transport somewhere between 12 and 15 million people from the African continent across the Atlantic in conditions of suffering that defy easy description, was the direct and causal consequence of the plantation system that Columbus's voyages had initiated. It was not an accident or a side effect. It was the logical outcome of a system of exploitation that required large amounts of coerced labor and was willing to obtain that labor through whatever means were available. The chain of causation runs unbroken from the morning of October 12, 1492, to the last slave ship that crossed the Atlantic in the 19th century.
Chapter 9. The Man Who Never Understood What He Had Found.
Columbus made 3 more voyages to the Caribbean, in 1493 to 1496, in 1498, and in 1502 to 1504, and none of them ended well. His second voyage, with 17 ships and more than 1,000 colonists, was the beginning of permanent European settlement in the Americas, and it revealed immediately that the qualities that had made Columbus a great navigator made him a disastrous colonial administrator. Decisiveness, independent judgment, the ability to maintain authority through force of personality, and uncompromising personal certainty about one's own rightness, these were precisely the wrong skills for managing a colonial settlement whose diverse population required negotiation, compromise, and institutional flexibility. When the fleet arrived at La Navidad in November 1493, they found the fort burned to the ground and all 39 men dead. The most probable reconstruction is that the men of La Navidad
freed from Columbus's authority, had begun raiding the surrounding Taíno villages for gold and women, provoking a violent response from a coalition of chieftains. Columbus moved on to found La Isabela, further east along the north coast of Hispaniola, which quickly descended into the endemic dysfunction of an under-resourced colonial venture. Disease among colonists not adapted to the tropical climate, food shortages, internal conflicts, and an increasingly brutal relationship with the Taíno population as Columbus imposed a tribute system requiring every adult Taíno to deliver a specified quantity of gold dust every 3 months on pain of mutilation. The tribute system was a disaster of administrative cruelty. The gold-bearing rivers of Hispaniola could not produce the quantities Columbus demanded, and when the Taíno failed to meet their quotas, as they invariably did because the quotas were impossible, Columbus's men cut off their hands. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar who would become the great chronicler and critic of Spanish atrocities in the Americas, described what he witnessed with a specificity of horror that makes the reading of his account genuinely disturbing, even 5 centuries later. His testimony makes clear that what was happening in Hispaniola by the mid-1490s was not a colonial administration with some unfortunate excesses, but a systematic program of exploitation and terror. By 1500, the situation had deteriorated so severely that the Spanish crown sent a royal commissioner, Francisco de Bobadilla, to investigate. Bobadilla arrived to find men hanging from the gallows. Columbus had been executing Spanish colonists as well as brutalizing the Taíno, and the colony in open rebellion. Bobadilla made the decision to send Columbus back to Spain in chains, literally in chains, the iron fetters of a common criminal applied to the admiral of the ocean sea. Columbus arrived in Seville shackled, furious, humiliated. Ferdinand and Isabella received him, restored his titles and privileges without formally convicting him of anything, but never returned effective authority to the new territories to him. The chains of Bobadilla left a mark that never entirely healed. The fourth voyage, in 1502 to 1504, was the most physically punishing of all. Columbus spent months exploring the coast of Central America, convinced he was looking for a strait that would lead him through to the Indian Ocean, enduring shipworm infestation so severe that 2 of his 4 ships had to be beached and abandoned in Jamaica, and spending nearly a year stranded on that island before a relief ship finally arrived. He returned to Spain in November 1504, an old man, broken in body and embittered in spirit, unable to walk without assistance, his hands trembling with what modern physicians retrospectively diagnose as reactive arthritis. Queen Isabella died that same month. Ferdinand, who had never been as personally invested in the enterprise as Isabella, had even less patience for Columbus's claims and complaints than before. The man who had changed the world was left to fight his legal battles in the margins of a court that had moved on.
He died in Valladolid in May 1506, at approximately 55 years old, still convinced he had reached Asia. He went to his grave arguing that Cuba was the Malay Peninsula, that Hispaniola was Japan, that the mainland he had briefly touched on his 3rd voyage was a promontory of the Asian continent near the location where, in Marco Polo's geography, the earthly paradise was supposed to stand. He was deeply, bitterly convinced that he had been cheated of the wealth and titles that were his by right under the capitulations of Santa Fe, and he spent his final years dictating letters and petitions to the monarchs, arguing his case with the same tenacious persistence that had gotten him across the ocean in the first place. The man who had changed the world died in relative obscurity in a rented house in Valladolid, attended by his sons and a few servants,
not greatly mourned by the court that had first celebrated and then discarded him. The hemisphere he had opened to European contact was named not for him, but for Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian navigator who sailed to South America in 1499 and 1501 and possessed something Columbus consistently lacked: the intellectual flexibility to recognize that what he was seeing was not the coast of Asia, but an entirely unknown landmass, a mundus novus, a new world. The German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller, drawing a New World map in 1507, labeled the new continent with a Latinized version of Vespucci's first name. The name stuck. Columbus, who had made the discovery, received a city in South Carolina and a holiday, now being renamed. Vespucci, who recognized what the discovery was, received 2 continents. The legacy of Columbus is and should be deeply contested. In the United States and across the Americas, the anniversary of his landfall has shifted from a straightforward celebration of European enterprise to a complex reckoning with what that enterprise cost the people who were already here. Columbus Day has given way in many places to Indigenous Peoples Day, a renaming that is not a cancellation of history, but an insistence that the full history be acknowledged, that the people whose world was destroyed by the events of October 12, 1492, be present in the commemorations of those events. The Taíno people of the Caribbean, those curious, generous, skillful people who came to the beach at Guanahani on the morning of October 12, 1492, with gifts in their hands, were effectively destroyed within a generation of contact. The civilizations of the Aztec and the Inca were conquered and dismantled within decades. Tens of millions of people died. A slave trade of almost incomprehensible scale was constructed to replace the labor that the dead could no longer provide. These are not footnotes to the story of 1492. They are the story. They are what 1492 means in the fullness of its consequences, stripped of the triumphalist narrative that earlier centuries used to make the catastrophe invisible. And yet, the crossing itself, 33 days on the open Atlantic, the cry of Tierra from the Pinta's deck, the green island rising from the sea in the morning light, remains one of the most extraordinary acts of human daring in recorded history. The world that exists today, with all its complexity and inequality and interconnection, is the world that crossing made. To understand how we got here, you must begin on the beach at Guanahani in the early morning of October 12, 1492, where 2 worlds that had not known of each other's existence stood for the first time face to face.
And yet the crossing itself, the act of navigation, the 33 days on the open Atlantic, the cry of Tierra from the Pinta's deck, remains one of the most extraordinary acts of human daring in recorded history. A man who was wrong about the size of the world, who had been rejected by every expert he consulted, who had been told by the best geographical minds of his generation that his calculations were incorrect and his enterprise impossible, sustained his conviction through 7 years of humiliation and refusal, and sailed his 3 small ships into an ocean no one had ever crossed, and reached land. The sheer audacity of what Columbus did, stripped of all the context that surrounds it, is genuinely astonishing. He did not know what was out there. He could not know. He had no evidence beyond his own calculations that were wrong, and his own unshakable belief in the rightness of his intuition, and he sailed anyway. The world that exists today, the political boundaries, the languages, the cuisines, the diseases that we have immunities to and those that still kill us,
the crops in the fields and the religions in the hearts of billions of people, is in every important sense the world that those 33 days on the Atlantic created. The encounter between the old world and the new that began on the beach at Guanahani in 1492 set in motion the processes that shaped modernity. The global circulation of people, pathogens, plants, and ideas that we call globalization, which began not in the 20th century, but in the 15th, not with container ships and the internet, but with 3 wooden vessels driven by the wind and navigated by the stars. The world was globalized by Columbus's crossing and by everything that followed it. The conquest and colonization of the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade, the agricultural revolution fed by American crops, the demographic transformation of 2 continents, and understanding globalization means understanding 1492 as its originating moment. The moral reckoning with Columbus and his legacy is not complete, and it should not be. Every generation has the obligation to look at the historical record with clear eyes and to resist the narratives of the past that served the purposes of those who wrote them. The statues of Columbus that have been toppled and debated across the Americas in recent years are not an erasure of history. They are history in action. Communities reconsidering who they choose to honor and why. The renaming of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day is not a denial of what happened in 1492, but a refusal to celebrate it without context, an insistence that the full story be told, including the story of the people who were already here, who had built civilizations of extraordinary sophistication over thousands of years, and who were destroyed in the aftermath of that October morning with a completeness that remains one of the greatest catastrophes in the history of our species. To hold both truths simultaneously, the audacity of the crossing and the horror of what followed it, the genius of the navigator and the cruelty of the colonial project, the wonder of discovery and the catastrophe of conquest, is not a contradiction but a necessity. History is rarely simple, and the history of 1492 is less simple than almost any other. The beach at Guanahani in the early morning light of October 12, 1492, is the place where the modern world began. It is a place of wonder and of tragedy in equal measure, and we cannot understand where we are if we do not understand what happened there, in the full complexity and ambiguity and moral weight of its consequences for everyone who was present.